second Georgia Green Landscape Stewards PowerPoint. There's a series of them. I've gone over this program a couple times, just as broad overview. And then we talked about, I think it was mulch. We've got next up is mulch. We were talking about composting last time. So a lot of you are master gardeners. As I sent everything out to everybody, I was like, wow, I have a big crowd of master gardeners. I guess you all need lots of continuing education. So that's why you're here, and that's good. You probably are already experts at this, which that's fine. Everybody can use a refresher course. All right, now you can hear me. Okay, so we're going to talk about invasive plants in the home landscape tonight. So since I mentioned that a lot of you are master gardeners, you've obviously taken the course, and there is an invasive species course that is in the currently 50 hours, but it was 42 hours when you took it. And that was probably a little bit more in depth than this is. This is kind of geared more towards the entire state of Georgia versus the invasive species course that you took was geared a little bit more towards what you would see around Gwinnett County and in the surrounding Piedmont region, because obviously that's where you guys are. Whereas this one is, like I said, a much broader view of South Georgia, some up into North Georgia. And I've got distribution maps on here. So we can talk a little bit about where these plants are problems and if they might become a problem here. But since everybody might move at some point, we had a lot of folks that kind of took off during the pandemic and said, hey, you know, we might as well just go ahead and live and move where the grandkids are, where the kids are, or I've just wanted to live, you know, in South Carolina my whole life. So you never know what you might encounter. If you head down to Florida, that is the land of invasive species. Anything and everything that's invasive apparently loves Florida. That is, in fact, I'd be shocked if there's any more native species left. About everything's crowded those out. So I'm going to go ahead and I got to start the slideshow here. Hopefully everybody can see that. All right. If can everybody see that? Give me a thumbs up. Okay, cool. All right. So invasive plants in the home landscape. And if you're kind of following along, of course, this is CE, but if you can get through all of the videos, these are also available to watch on your own if you choose to do that on the website that I've given in the past. But we'll work our way through all of the PowerPoint. So if you prefer to listen to either me or Eric talk, then you're in luck. So just a little blurb about the presentation being part of UGA's Extension Service and funded, this program's funded by Center for Urban Ag. Okay, so what makes a plant invasive? So that's going to be a non-native plant that's going to displace native species, and they generally reproduce with abandon. They can tolerate a very wide range of growing conditions. So they might be fine in drought or wet or sunny or shady or all of the above. They produce copious amounts of seed. They have all sorts of modes of being able to spread. And there's just no real predators out there. So maybe birds disperse the seeds very easily. There's no natural predators because they've come from someplace else. So a lot of what you've probably already figured out, and if you haven't already figured it out just by being a master gardener, being involved in the gardening world, is that a lot of what we see here in Zone 7B actually comes from over in the Far East. So that would be Japan, China, some parts of Vietnam, areas over there that are also Zone 7B. What they don't have, however, is the high humidity and the higher rainfall that we have here in Georgia. So plants that did okay over there and were perfectly suited to the climate in their native land, he got here and said, wow, there's a lot more rain, there's a lot more humidity. And because of that, and also the birds and other wildlife that may be discovered, the berries or the other types of fruit that might be growing on these were easily spread and now are becoming really problematic throughout the entire Southeast. And there's some in here that we'll talk about that are kind of on the national map, but it doesn't ever hurt to know, what's around and to keep an eye out for it in case you happen to be traveling and you might see that. So invasive plants can also cause economic and environmental harm. So a weed is a plant out of place, and an invasive can do a lot of environmental harm. They can outcompete native species that maybe, we use for monetary value in crops or something like that. They can cause harm by, weed seeds being mixed in with whatever the crop is. They're in some way harming the, economic viability of, the crop, if it's involved with that, or in your general home landscape, they might be out competing other plants. I know I have a wild, I think it's the obedient plant. I have some of them up at a house I have in the mountains, and I have some wild mums, and it has basically not very obedient. It's outcompeted the mums and taken over, and now it's pretty much makes up the entire planting bed. So there's a range of criteria, and you have to kind of look at it on a spectrum. Some plants will be a little bit more invasive than other plants. You can classify them as like a class 1 or 2 or 3. Some of them, if they're in the right conditions, can become invasive, but in a generalized, if you're placing them, where they prefer to be, they're just normal plants. Autumn fern would be a good one. That's actually not really on a list. I have some around my house. I have had them for years. They do not grow out of their bounds. They pretty much stayed where I put them. Although some other people might find that they have an area along maybe a stream bank where they've kind of gotten out of control. So it's a spectrum. You just have to kind of keep an eye on some of these. But generally speaking, the reason the ones that are in this list have made it here is because they show all of the characteristics of being an invasive. So they're going to also utilize a longer growing condition, and that outcompetes a lot of the native species. So obviously, if you don't have any competition, you can grow longer, then you're the food source, and that gives you an extra added bonus that natives may not have. They might use chemical warfare, allelopathy. So a lot of people know, like, black walnut trees have that, and that helps prevent anything from growing underneath them, which is great. But unfortunately, some of the plants that are on this list, they also grow by rhizomes underground, and they use allelopathy, which then prevents anything from growing around them. And then they're able to spread without any problem and any competition at all. So that's an unfair advantage, if you will. Their seed has very high viability. So sometimes when we're swapping seeds, we notice that our germination rates aren't that great. We don't have that problem here. You usually will see copious amounts of seeds with very high germination rates, and they are very successful in dispersing those seeds. So birds, usually that's a very easy way of dispersing seeds. So a lot of these particular invasives will have really tasty fruit that the birds like, and they'll eat it up, and then they fly and do what birds do. And then before you know it, you've got another colony of whatever the plant is, and you're trying to contain it there. They also thrive on disturbance in just about any habitat. So there are some plants, a lot of natives, that they have very preferred places where they grow, and that's where they are, and that's where they want to be. And they don't do well outside of whatever those conditions are. A lot of these plants can thrive in any location, in any type of soil, in any moisture content. They're not heavy feeders. They just are really non-discriminatory. And so that's a big advantage to them. And lastly, it's the second largest threat to biodiversity. You know, we're not the only ones that have to deal with invasives. I mean, that's around the globe. So this being able to let you know what all of these species are so that you can help identify them and hopefully be on the lookout. So we're going to just kind of run through a big long list of plants that are considered invasive. I'm not going to go super in depth into them. A lot of them you probably already know. Some of you may have in your own landscape, but no, you know, this will be a good way for you to realize that sometimes they're not always the best landscape plants. I know we see lantana in a lot of the nurseries around here, and there are some, a couple varieties that are perennial. They'll come back every year, but you do have to watch, and especially when you get down into the southern parts of the state and along coastal areas where it's a little more temperate, we don't have the possibilities of having a harsh winter like we just did. You may end up with lantana spreading. It does provide a lot of berries that are easily eaten by the birds, and then that's dispersed. This you'll see a lot of times in the West Indies or Caribbean islands, and it grows there. You'll see it growing along the hillside, and it is, you know, one of the favorites of disturbed areas. And you'll start noticing the pretty little flowers. Pollinators like it, but it is considered an invasive. So you do have to be careful. So what you see down here is I've added in the EDD map, and I'll try to, hopefully I can remember. Eric, if I forget at the end, remind me. I'll provide the link to that website. So if you're curious, you can go and type in, you know, any plant that you think is invasive, and if it is, it'll pop up and you'll get a nice distribution map like you see here. If I've cut the map off, like you can see, I cut off Oregon and Washington and above Illinois into Michigan and all that. That's because you won't see any of that up there. It's too cold. So basically any place you see green, that is where it is established. That is a county, and that is where it is currently established and found. But if it's not outside of that, if I've cut the map off, then it does not exist there in that area. Anyway, so the lantana is introduced to the US from the West Indies as an ornamental, and it tends to, again, invade disturbed areas and crowds out native species. The leaves and the unripened fruit are poisonous to humans and other animals. Birds will eat them. They're unharmed from that, but you know, don't go out there and think that's a blueberry and pop that. I guess that's the the take home here. And make sure, you know, a lot of times what I'll do is if I've got it in a pot, I'll pop that top part off after it's done flowering if there's any berries there, so that I don't have to worry about the birds eating them. All right, Mexican petunias. So I know you can find these at a lot of nurseries around here, and a lot of us have them in our yards. So again, this area in 7B is a transition zone. So some years we might have really warm winters. I can remember winters where I had geraniums, which are typically annuals, and they survived all winter long and just picked up where they left off in the spring. And then we can have winters where it's really cold, like it was this last winter. We, you know, lost a lot of, you know, shrubs and some trees, and then we had another late freeze. And so some of our trees are still fighting to leaf out at this point because they got nipped again. But these Mexican petunias, I would be shocked. It would be something that you would probably see down in South Georgia. I know you can see along in South Carolina, definitely Florida and the Gulf Coast and parts of Alabama. You might see some up through the Macon area, but currently it is not found in and around Gwinnett County or the Atlanta metro area. So just kind of be wary that when it likes where it is, it can aggressively spread. So that is something just to put on your radar. Nandina, this is one that we've known about for quite a while. Back about 25 years ago, maybe a little longer, maybe 30 years ago, it was a very, very popular landscape plant. All the developers, they must have bought out all the Nandina stock, is all I can think of, because it was in every single house and every single subdivision. And now if you see the older shopping malls and strip malls and that kind of thing, you can see how it spread. I live in Loganville, and every so often I'll go over to Kelly's home cooking over here, and we'll have breakfast. And that shopping center has been there since probably the 90s or 80s, somewhere in there. They have a bunch. You could see where it was originally, and then you can see where it's now spread in through all of the shrubbery, all up and down in that shopping center. And that's because of these little red berries. So firepower was the big one that, I think that was the variety that you mostly found at the nurseries. And that is also one of the most invasive. So again, if you've got Nandina and you can see this just driving along on the side of the road now in older home sites, about the time when you'll start to see the berries in the fall, and you can see where it is. But if you've got any in your landscape and you don't want to dig it up, that's fine. Just make sure when you see the berries like that you snap them off and throw them away. That'll help prevent the birds from getting to them. And, it can also kill the birds if they eat enough of them. But yeah, that'll prevent some of the problems that we're seeing now. Elephant ear. I bet you probably didn't know that. That one was a little surprising to me, but this one is more probably an invasive down in the southern part of the state and into Florida along the Gulf Coast and into Texas. So probably, zone 9 and south of there is where it's going to be a problem. Although you might get it up as far as Macon. So I had some in some containers, and they're pretty much mush now after that big freeze that we had. But I did have some in the ground, and I've seen some of the ears coming up now. So they can get very big, and they are very showy and pretty. But just be aware that if they're in a nice sheltered location that's very moist, that you may have them start to spread and grow out of control. I think that's actually how I got mine. Is sometimes when I'm teaching one of the Master Gardener courses, people will bring in plants that they need to divide and get rid of, and somebody brought in a big bag of elephant ears. So few people took them, and there was just a big bag left. So I took them home, and I stuck a few here and there and put some in pots on my deck, and the ones in the ground survived. So just know that if it likes where it is, it can definitely get a little out of hand. Sword ferns. These were introduced from Asia and Australia. Again, these are kind of subtropical to tropical. So I don't really expect that this is going to be an issue up here around Gwinnett County. You can see that it is down in South Georgia, right on the Florida border, and that's basically it right now. So again, like I said, Florida, that's just the land of invasives. I mean, not only plants, but animals too. I mean, you can pretty much find anything, all the aquarium trade, the reptile trade. I mean, just everything lives in Florida. It's a little scary. And I sometimes make jokes about Australia and how some of the animals there will kill you, but I think everything that lives in Australia is probably in Florida now. So you might be careful walking outside at night if you're going down to Florida. But again, I don't think we'll see a problem with this up here. But it is something to keep in the back of your mind if you're thinking of moving to Florida or southern Alabama, Georgia, and along into the Carolinas or anywhere along the Gulf Coast. Asparagus fern. So this one is used a lot in annual pots as a filler, and it does, I can confirm, overwinter quite nicely if you don't have a very severe winter. There's been many winters where it's overwintered in the pots that I've had on my deck and it comes back. So totally conceivable that if you have some pots and it's in a more sheltered area, or maybe along a stream or something like that, that it will establish itself and help outcompete some of the native species. It does have little seeds on there, and you just have to kind of be wary. So I would definitely keep it in a pot if you're going to have it, and just kind of keep an eye on it and make sure that you don't see any popping up around your yard. Brazilian vervain. So this is a verbena, and many of us probably have had this in our landscape. Some of you may have it now. So this was introduced to the US from South America as an ornamental. It's very heat and drought tolerant, which is why it's done really well here in Georgia, because we'll flip back and forth between super wet and super dry. So it can typically handle that. And as you can see, the Gulf states and along the southern Atlantic states and into Florida, it's definitely very well established. So just kind of keep an eye on it. It can, like I said, it can take over. So you want to make sure that it isn't getting out of hand if you do have it in your landscape. Coral ardisia. So again, this one is down in the southern part of the state. I don't anticipate it being a problem up around here. Like I said, we're in a transition zone, but it could move up into the Macon area. So just kind of beware of that. Introduced to the US from Japan and northern India. And it can shade out the understory, and just kind of like privet does. I don't know if it'll become the new privet. Privet's in here. We'll talk a little bit about that and the history behind that. But just know that if you see it, then it's probably too late. Now last week is when you can kind of see the privet blooming out there. And it's taken a while, but there's an interesting chart that I usually put with the Master Gardener course that shows how long it took privet to really get established. And then once it did, its population exploded and it grew exponentially. So again, just kind of keep an eye on that and be aware if you see something like this up north of Macon, in and around this area. Check back here on the EDD maps and see if it's moving, to be aware that you might have some that pops up in your backyard. Rattlebox. So this is up and around. It's been found up in Hall County. Looks like a few metro counties around there, here and there. This is introduced to the US from South America, and it will displace native vegetation and wildlife because it forms really super dense thickets. And the bad news is that all parts of this plant are poisonous. So it's not like, it's edible or anything like that. Very few redeeming characteristics. You can actually buy this on the internet. Not quite sure why you'd want to plant that in your landscape, but it is available for purchase. But then again, what isn't available for purchase online? You can probably get it on Amazon. You can buy anything on Amazon. All right, Chinese privet. So I mentioned that a few minutes ago, and that's blooming pretty much right now. So I mentioned that it was really like in the 50s, or maybe it was earlier than that. But it took about 30 years for Chinese privet to be introduced, from when it was introduced to when it basically grew out of control. And so by the time, I think the take home here is really kind of keep an eye on things. It was a no man's land way back there in the 20s up until probably the 50s or 60s. And so a lot of stuff was introduced just because someone thought it was a great idea. They didn't really test it or try to figure out if it was a good idea or a bad idea. They just thought, oh, this will do great. It's got some redeeming characteristics. Let's put it in the ground and see how it does. Well, now we've learned. So that's not necessarily done. So if there are any new plants that are, considered to be something that might do well in a garden setting, and the horticultural world wants to introduce that, they'll put them in test gardens. They have a series of criteria that they go through to kind of judge to see, is this going to be invasive in this particular habitat? And so there's a lot more responsibility now, whereas way back when they didn't know that kind of stuff and hard lessons were learned. But basically, like I mentioned, is it took about, 30 years and that for privet to kind of get a foothold. And then by the time we all started noticing it, it was too late. It had basically taken over everywhere. And you can see the entire Southeast, all the way up the Eastern seaboard, all the way over into Texas and up into Southern Illinois. Obviously, it can handle the more temperate winters, colder winters that you get. It loves the Southeast. I was along the Chattahoochee last week for an urban ecology workshop, and there was an area along the river where the Park Service owned that they said they had gone and cleaned out the privet a year and a half ago, I guess. And, thankfully it's easy to pull by hand, but oh man, you could already see the little seedlings. They were probably 3 or 4 inches tall, and they were everywhere. And that was just, what had come back in that very short period of time. So, it's easy to kill, but it spreads super easy. And the birds really love the berries, which is part of the problem. Okay. Glossy privet. This is another in the privet family, a little less known than Chinese privet, but again, from the same location. So it'll form dense thickets, outcompetes, produces a lot of seed, and that makes it easy to spread and really difficult to eradicate because there's just so much seed. And the birds are just perfectly happy to spread it around. So you can see it's pretty blocky. It's not fully green on the map and established in every single county, but I can almost guarantee you that if the county next to you has it, you have it. You probably just are either misinterpreting it as a Chinese privet or just haven't noticed it yet. Sometimes if you look at it and you kind of, you're like, okay, I'm going to keep an eye out for that. That's when you start noticing it. So almost certainly it is in just about every county in Georgia. It's just that it's not as well known as its other cousin. And so here it is, glossy privet. Keep a lookout for it. Autumn olive. Elaeagnus is out there a lot more than you think it is. There are a couple kinds. There's a thorny version, and you don't think about it, and then you notice what it is, and it's easily seen from the really silvery undersides of its leaves. It can produce copious amounts of fruit, and it's got kind of an arching and creeping way. So it'll arch out and spread a little bit, and then arch out, spread a little bit, and it's got so much fruit. It says here that it can produce up to 8 pounds a year. That's a lot. And so the birds are spreading that. So you can see where it started. Generally, when you get the real solid filled in areas of establishment, and then it starts to kind of spread out around there, you can see about where it started, which would be up in Ohio and maybe up in the New York area. But obviously it can tolerate the colder winters and is perfectly happy. So it's all the way down here. I've got some of it in my backyard. Cut it down. It keeps trying to come back. So it's kind of tough to kill. Thorny olive, so close relative. Also, I've got this in my yard. It's like Invasive's central out there. Every time I go teach the class, I don't have to go very far to collect a bunch of invasives to showcase to all the students. But this one's thorny. obviously, than the name, and found pretty much throughout the Southeast, up through Virginia, West Virginia, and to Maryland and all of that, Texas. Little isolated county up there in New York area. But, I would expect this one will probably continue to spread. It's, it's got berries, so the birds can get to it. And this one does climb more and will climb up into trees. And so it'll block it out almost, doesn't grow as fast as wisteria, but anyway, it's definitely competition. Golden bamboo, I think we all know this one. Golden bamboo is all over the place around here. And this stuff is really difficult to get rid of. So long ago, somebody thought it would be great to plant this probably as a screen. It is all over downtown Atlanta. You cannot get rid of this stuff. Pretty much just one tiny little rootlet will start the whole process again. So there are other types of bamboo. My mom, I'm going to poke fun at her because she got some black bamboo. She'll probably yell at me because I brought her up. She was complaining about it and saying she really wished she hadn't planted that, because now that it's established, it's popping up in her yard every time you get a big rain, or in the spring when you get a new flush of growth. That stuff will put out underground runners that can go 10 or 12 feet, 20 feet sometimes away from the main stand. And so that's not really fun. I mean, you can contain it, but you're going to have to do a lot of work to do that. Golden bamboo is more invasive. I've got that stuff. One of my neighbors in the back decided, wouldn't it be a great idea to plant some of that stuff? And so now it's running across. I've got a power line right away, way out at the back of our property. And it's about halfway across there now. The subdivision is about 20 years old. I'm surprised it's taken that long, but it did move from his house, which sits on about an acre. So it's moved, I don't know, maybe an acre and a half during that time. And, the power line company comes and cuts it down every couple of years, but we know that that's kind of a futile effort. It will march across and probably into my neighbor's yard next to me. And I'm hoping it doesn't move into my yard, but somewhere down the line it might. Anyway, if you do decide that you really like bamboo, make sure you put it in something that's metal, like a livestock tank. I've seen it used in situations where it's on a concrete slab and they put it in livestock tanks, and then it makes a really interesting screen around, maybe a busier or smaller backyard. It has really no hope of escaping that, but honestly, I don't know. It may figure out how to escape that. It could probably push through metal if you gave it enough time. Yeah, golden bamboo is one of the bad ones. Indian fig, and you're probably going, what is an Indian fig? Well, it's also known as the prickly pear cactus or the tuna cactus. I have to admit, I don't know why they're calling it a tuna cactus, because it doesn't really resemble a tuna. I don't know. I know you can eat it, but I don't think it tastes like tuna. Maybe somebody will look that up and tell us later. But this was introduced to the U.S. from Mexico, and it is known to displace native species of plants and animals by overtaking the landscape. I do want to make mention that this is not the same cactus that we have here in Georgia. That's a native, and it is in the same family, but it is not the same. So don't feel like you need to go pull out your neighbor's cactus if they have some growing in their front yard. I have a few bits here and around in my property that I find occasionally, and it doesn't grow very fast. It's perfectly happy to stay in a small clump. So don't feel worried that you need to go over and let them know that they're growing an invasive. As you can see, it does tend to prefer warmer and drier climates based on where it is currently found. But just be aware of that if you do move to any of these locations or know somebody that is out there, that it can be a problem. Chinese or Japanese wisteria. I think we all know this one. I made one of the cardinal mistakes of a new homeowner when I bought my home many, many years ago, and I actually planted some wisteria. And that stuff took over the tree. It had a huge trunk on it that was probably like, I don't know, maybe a foot wide. It was huge. It got up into the crown of the tree, grew from all, yeah. So finally, it took us like, well, I don't even know if it's completely dead now. We've been trying to kill that thing for like 3 years. So we cut it back, we put Roundup on it, we put brush killer, we put stump killer. Those roots will continue to send up new shoots until they're finally dead. And I mean, it's still alive. In fact, I looked out there the other day and I noted that the root system had shot up another new shoot out of the original base. So I got to go out there and spray it again. But yeah, this stuff can grow not quite as fast as kudzu, which can grow about a foot a day. This stuff can grow, you know, a foot and a half a week. That's a lot. And you'll note it by the fact that typically you'll get the flush of purple blooms before it leaves out in the spring. And so this year it was kind of early. So we saw it probably late February, early March, when we had that warmer spell where they were blooming alongside the road. Looks really pretty. It's just very invasive, and it will crawl up in the treetops just like kudzu will, and it'll choke out other plants by aggressively shading and strangling them. So we try, and you can still buy it in the nurseries. I just shake my head at that. There's some varieties that are more shrub growing or have that habit, and they don't climb up into the trees. But yeah, you can still buy this stuff in the nursery. I don't know why they don't outlaw it. They need to. Periwinkle or vinca, you can get a variegated variety of this, or this is not the variegated variety. So introduced to the US from Europe and West Asia, and much like English ivy, it can take over everything and all along the forest floor. So you can see it prefers more temperate areas. You've got Indiana, up into parts of Canada. You've got a few areas of New Mexico up into the Washington State and Oregon, where it is a little cooler, more like what you'd see up along the eastern seaboard, and up into the mountain areas. Although again, you do have some little temperate areas, pockets, microclimates around Metro Atlanta, where you can grow this probably along some waterways where it's going to stay a little cooler. English ivy. I have this in my house. It takes a while to get established, but once it's established, it's really hard to get rid of. It's very easy to pull out, excuse me, but it will climb up trees. When you're trying to get it out of the trees, don't try to pull it out. Just cut it around the trunk and let it die, and then it'll just naturally, the leaves will fall off. But when you try to pull the vine out of or off of the bark, it'll take the bark with it. So that's not good for the tree, and that can be an in for disease-causing organisms. So if you're trying to clean it out, try not to pull it out of the trees. You can definitely pull it out of the ground. It takes a lot of back-breaking work. Some people will rent goats to try to eat it. It's not advised. It can cause some stomach discomfort. And, a lot of times it's just easier to just pull it out. So sometimes you can get big landscape crews that will come, they'll pull it all out, and then they'll recommend that as the new sprouts start to come up, before the leaves get really waxy, that you spray them with non-selective herbicide like Roundup or glyphosate, or one of the other non-selectives that will be more likely to kill the roots. Because at that point, the plant doesn't have a waxy leaf, which helps prevent some of that from being absorbed. It's more tender, usually you've ripped out most of the roots, so it's just a couple little rootlets and easier to kill at that point. And you can see it's pretty well established along the West Coast and all the way through the Midwest in there, and we'll probably continue to see it march across the country. It'll be interesting to see if if it moves into some of the more drier areas or the mountain areas, but we're not there yet. Japanese honeysuckle, it is well entrenched in the southeast and over into California, and the southwest. And we have a native here, coral honeysuckle, not invasive at all. This was brought over to the U.S. from Japan, and it will outcompete everything. It will crawl all over your shrubs and smother out plants and small trees. I bought some like 25 years ago because I like the smell of it, and I planted it and it grew out of control, and I'm now rip it out, and I still rip it out every spring. I'm ripping some of it out. It doesn't want to die. It's very, very prolific. So you can put a lot of effort into it. It smells really good. Supposedly you can take the flowers and you can suck the nectar out a little bit. Tastes pretty good, kind of sweet. But there are other options if you want to plant honeysuckle that are better. Catclaw vine, this one, again, will probably stay South Georgia into Florida, along in Texas and the Gulf Coast. Introduced from the tropical Americas, so Central America, South America, that kind of thing. And it will produce a vine that smothers native vegetation. And you can see the little claw structure there that it uses to adhere to and climb up trees. So once again, poor Florida's hit the jackpot and has to worry about this one too. It's pretty, but not very good to have in your landscape. Kudzu, this has probably got to be like #1 in the top 10 of invasives, most recognizable in the Southeast. I can remember when I was a kid, just being entranced by how it grew over some of the hills and just took over everything when I would see it. And this picture does a pretty good job of showcasing that. It just smothers everything. Nothing can survive underneath it. I mean, it chokes out the light for everything. It can grow 12 inches a day. The growth rate on this stuff is phenomenal. It was brought over to the U.S. from East Asia, Japan, China, Japan. There's, some thoughts there. People are like, well, it's definitely Japan. And some people say China, but definitely from East Asia. And it was originally, I believe, brought over as cattle fodder, but, and it's edible. I mean, you can eat it, and the flowers smell like grape bubble yum. So every time we do the home show, we have home show trivia. And that's actually one of the trivia questions is, what do kudzu flowers smell like? And they smell like grape bubble yum. So you can make a jam out of them if you collect enough of them, and it smells like grape bubble yum. But that doesn't redeem. It's not a redeeming quality. But people will gather it and use the vines to make, wreaths and other miscellaneous stuff. But it's pretty much out of control. Like, it takes a while to get established sometimes, but once it is established, it just takes over. So there are no good qualities for it. And it is up into Illinois and continues to grow. It just, it gets knocked back in the wintertime, but then it starts growing again in the spring. And, it's evil. Skunk vine. So this was introduced from Asia, and it can survive in a bunch of different habitats and become so dense that, just like with kudzu, it can cause a tree to collapse. So this one, you can see it's got a very spotty distribution right now. Florida is probably the worst off, but it's in South Carolina and up into North Carolina. So it probably at this point looks like it will stay maybe Macon South if we do get it, but it is something that we need to watch. Puncture vine, pretty self-explanatory. So it looks like mimosa weed or chamber bitter. It looks like it's probably in the mimosa family, and it was introduced from Europe. But the seeds, man, look at those things. Those are evil. I would hate to walk all over those. And I'm sure you can imagine if you drive over them. I was looking it up, doing a little research earlier. Yeah, it can puncture your tire. So you have to be careful if it's out in a pasture situation where you have animals or kids. I mean, I wouldn't want to walk on that. That could cause some serious damage. But they can form dense mats, and yeah, they're really, according to most of the literature I was reading, the best thing to do is just pull them out, get them out before they're able to flower and create seeds. But they're a big problem in grazing lands out west. We just have, it looks like, a few down along the coast here in Georgia, down maybe Brunswick area and into Florida, but it is a very big problem out west. Air potato. I had someone contact me last summer about air potato. So really, they were in North Gwinnett County, so we probably needed to go ahead, and I asked them and gave them the information to input it into the system, but I see that didn't happen because this is an updated map as I just added it today. So air potato was introduced to the US from Africa, and it was actually brought in as a food source, if you can imagine that. These little starchy tuberals are supposed to taste similar to a potato. They just grow in vines and they'll grow up trees, and they're really hard to kill, which this person was really having a difficult time. They knew what it was, they'd looked it up, and they were looking for additional ways to try to get rid of it because they were having a hard time doing that. And the biggest thing is you do not want to let these little tubers, arils, fall, because that's obviously how they reproduce. They crawl up into the treetops, and not only are they going to smother that tree by restricting sunlight and reducing the water flow, but they're also going to use their height advantage to drop their seeds, which are those little potatoes. That's how they reproduce, and then each one of those is going to sprout up and cause more issues. So best to get that, even though it is an attractive vine, you don't want it reproducing. Japanese climbing fern. There is a lot of this in the Atlanta area, and it is pretty. I have seen it growing up the sides of pine trees. It grows a lot down in South Georgia, and then all of that pine straw gets brought up here to central Georgia and up into North Georgia. Now, it does prefer a warmer, wetter climate. So other than a few small places where we can see that it has established itself in North or Southern Kentucky, a couple counties in Tennessee and up into North Carolina, mostly it's stayed contained in the southeastern states along the Gulf states there. So, and considering it was introduced in the 30s, it's not going to rampantly run away from us, but it can change ecosystems because it just will blanket everything. And when it dries out, it can cause a fire hazard. So even though it is pretty, and I know some people that are happy to have it in their Japanese kind of gardens, it's probably a bad idea and should be taken out. Chinese tallow. So introduced from China, very fast growth and can crowd out native species. This one, as you can see, it has these long tendrils. That's for the seeds, and you can get up to 100,000 seeds per tree. So it's one of those that falls into the category of very prolific seed production, and it's lots of viable seed. So it's trying very hard to spread itself around just by having abundant seed production. It's toxic to cattle, and if you ingest any of the seed, it can cause vomiting in humans. And so you can see it's out in California. You've got a little patch up in Wisconsin, but mostly contained to the southeast. Tree of Heaven. This is loved by the lanternfly. I know one of the, so I usually do a tree invasive species or bush shrub tree plant, and I also do one on insects. And the lanternfly, which is actually a pretty insect but can cause all sorts of problems, loves the tree of heaven. So it's a good attractant for them. This was introduced from China. We got a lot of stuff from China. And it's one of those that uses allopathy or releases a chemical like the black walnut that can kill off or prevent nearby plants from growing near where it is. It also spreads via underground rhizomes. So you get these big groves of it that pop up, and it loves to grow just about anywhere. I mean, you can get these disturbed clay-ridden hillsides that are highly eroded, and this stuff will grow there. So it's not very particular. You can see it does not like cold weather. You get the upper tier states like Minnesota and Wisconsin and the Dakotas and Montana and Colorado. It is not a fan of super cold weather. So I think you're probably safe if you move there, but it is just about everywhere else. And surprisingly so, it's not super happy in Florida, which is kind of ironic, isn't it? Since Florida seems to have everything else. Chinaberry. This is a horrible little tree that drops all of these noxious little berries all over your yard, and birds can eat them, but they're not partial to them, meaning you will have lots of these noxious little berries that you would hope that the birds would eat, but they only eat a few and then leave the rest of them, and then you have to rake them up and burn them or whatever. But it lowers the biodiversity in native ecosystems because those seeds will then germinate, and then you get all these annoying little trees that pop up everywhere, and you can't use any part of it. Humans and other mammals can't eat them. They're poisonous, so they really have very little in the way of redeeming qualities. And they're found mostly along the southern tier of the country. You just don't see a lot of them up in any of the northern countries, although the northern states and counties, although you do see a few. There looks like there's some up in New York and some around Chicago and so on and so forth. Mimosa, I have this in my yard. I actually planted it. Who knew, right? I thought it was pretty. It was long ago, don't worry. It's a introduction from China, much like everything else around here. It will form small groves. So it has a long seed pod. It looks like something out of a tropical savanna in Africa. It is a pretty tree. And if it's by itself as a specimen tree, it has a very nice shape to it. But it produces copious amounts of seed, and it spreads very easily, and the birds will spread. Every year I have to go walk under the tree after it, starts growing in the spring and pull up all the dumb seedlings that come up from the dumb tree and all of its seeds. So I really regret planting that thing. And I've noticed a few that have popped up in my neighbors' yards, and they just kind of leave them. They do have a nice smell to them, but again, they are invasive. They do not seem to care for cooler weather that you see up in the Midwest into the northern tier states. They do prefer warmer weather. So you see kind of a hard stop on that distribution map. They just really haven't moved much further up into the Midwest than southern Illinois, southern Indiana, and Missouri. You might see them, they don't particularly care for super dry either. So that's why you're not seeing them really move into West Texas. But they've been here a while. Camphor tree, introduced to Florida from China and Japan for camphor production. So it smells kind of medicinally, and it produces seed very quickly, and then it really can take over. But it is a tropical species. I don't think we'll ever see that up here, but you can see it definitely along the Gulf Coast where it is very humid, hot, and that's definitely where it's found. And then in some parts of California, although I'm not so sure about that one up there in North Dakota. That's kind of weird. I might have to look that one up. Bradford pear, calorie pear. We all hate it, but hey, we planted a lot of them back about 20, 30 years ago. Back then it had, the nice pretty flowers. It looked perfect. It had a really nice shape to it. And then about 30 years later, we all discovered why it was a really bad idea to put those in there. So they were brought over from China as a sterile flowered ornamental. That obviously was a lie. The increased genetic diversity, now we get the calorie pair, which if you look out in any vacant field, all those seeds sprouted and you'll get that flush of white blooms that are not wild cherry. They're the calorie pair, and they have thorns and will tear your tires up if you try to drive out there. They are a real problem, and they are really have taken over a lot of the Southeast. And again, it looks down there like it's a patchwork, but almost guaranteed that every county has them because they were planted out of control. Like that was just the landscape favorite to plant. So they're a horrible tree because they have a very upright growth pattern in their trunk. If everybody had known or thought about it when they planted them way back when, they could have gone in and actually pruned out some of the leaders, central leaders in the trunk, so that there were maybe one or two, and their trees would now be a little bit stronger, but nobody knew. And so now at 30 years old or so, 25, 30 years old, a lot of those branches, if you get some high storm winds, the tree is older, it's more mature, branches are really heavy, and the whole thing will just split down, it'll peel, split down the middle, and then you just have to take the tree out. So it's a safety hazard. Pindo palm, otherwise known as a jelly palm. We don't really have these. Let's see, 658. So I'm going to have to speed through. I'm not going to say much about this. It's really only found in Florida. But if you get down there, just be aware of it because it does have, it can be damaging to native plants. White mulberry, found mostly in the Midwest, but you can find it occasionally down here. It was brought in for food for silkworms, and it can invade forest edges and displace native species. So just be aware of it. There is also white mulberry, but that is not considered invasive. But just keep an eye out for this. Tongue oil tree, again, mostly along the Gulf Coast. Probably not going to be an issue up here. But the leaves and the nuts are very toxic to humans and to livestock, and this is used for tongue oil, but it can outcompete native plants. So just kind of be aware of that. Brazilian pepper tree, again, mostly Florida, prolific at producing seeds, brought into the US from Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. Invades native plant communities and does have an allergic reaction, kind of like poison ivy. So again, we don't have it here, but that doesn't mean that you're going to move someplace and you're not going to have to deal with it there. It is a big problem in Florida, but there are some positive notes on the horizon. They have identified a couple of biocontrols. They're little wasps, I believe, and they actually have done a pretty good job of controlling some of the pepper trees down there, since you find them along a lot of the swamp areas. It's actually kind of interesting. I go into it a little bit more in the Master Gardener course. Kogon grass, we have that here. I was telling Eric earlier that 4 years ago, it really wasn't a thing. And now it's pretty much around Metro Atlanta. So you can see it's pretty much taken over Alabama, Florida. And it's, I would say, even if you don't see your county highlighted or don't see the county highlighted in Georgia, it's probably already there. That's usually what happens. But the problem is when it's dry in the fall, it's a big fire hazard. So it's pretty to look at, spreads very fast, the seeds can cause problems, and it's flammable. Crowfoot grass, we do have that here and there. It pops up in people's lawns. A lot of times if you get a new sodded lawn, it'll be grown somewhere in Georgia, South Georgia, and that might be in there if you don't get certified turf. So just be kind of aware. If you see that little claw-like flowering structure up at the top, that's probably what it is, and you might want to hand pull that and get it out of there. Torpedo grass, more of an issue along the Gulf states, like the Florida, southern parts of the Gulf states, southern Georgia. I don't think we'll see much of an issue here. Resembles Bermuda a little bit. but it can get out of control in citrus groves and turf. Water hyacinths, some of you probably have this in water gardens. In a little water garden, it's not a problem, but what I want as a takeaway here is if you get rid of your water garden or you have too much of it, do not put it into a pond or a lake or anything. Destroy it, throw it out, let it dry out, throw it away. Don't release it into the waterways. That's part of Florida's big problem. But we don't want to spread this. It does a great job of choking things out, and we just don't want to help it along. Alligator weed, you can see this all over the place here. I see it all the time in ponds. It's a wetland type plant, and it can grow in very thick, dense mats. So that brings us right about to the end. So what can you do? Don't buy invasive plants. So now you've seen some of them. Some look pretty, but don't buy them. Don't share invasive plants. So if you have some in your yard, don't give them away. Don't sell them. Don't spread them around. Remove them from your landscape if you can. Physically remove them all, roots, everything. Put it in a bag, burn it, get rid of it. Don't put it in your compost heap, just get rid of it. You want to spray it with glyphosate or triclofor. We usually talk in active chemicals. So those are systemics, non-selective herbicides. And be careful if you're spraying near water with that alligator weed. You want to make sure that you're using something that's formulated for use in and around an aquatic system, because you can kill stuff, and you don't want to be the one that, DNR has to come out and knock on your door because there's a fish kill because you sprayed something you weren't supposed to. Cut and paint trees with herbicide. Cut them down and then make sure that you get a herbicide on them immediately before they have a chance to start to protect the wound, and educate others. And then the certification checklist items, don't buy or share those invasive plants. Make sure you remove them all, trash, debris, burn bag, all of that stuff, applying the proper herbicide according to the label, very important. Make sure you use your PPEs, personal protective equipments, using an aquatic formulation, and remove established or invasive trees by cutting and painting the trunk with herbicide. So with that, I am done. And let's see, it looks like we've got some questions.
So how about I go through, I'll read some of these questions off and you can answer them as you're able. So I'm going up and I'm starting with the very first question, which was from Lori, asking should we be seeing a link to this list, quote unquote, or are you speaking generally about the invasive plant list? That question may have been in part answered by us sending out the PowerPoint, which is a later question.
Yes. I have the link to the website for the EDD maps that I'm going to give you all so you can go back and look at all of that. And you can look up all sorts of plants and animals and everything else on there. You'll get distribution maps of where everything is. You'll get pictures, identifying pictures, characteristics. It's a great website. And I believe there's another one here. This is the USDA plant database. And you can take a look there for invasive species.
All right.
But there's no list, full-on list. I mean, these are all going to be national lists of everything where they monitor, where you can report if you come across an invasive species. There's let me see, I thought maybe one more. I don't think I got rid of that. Yeah, there are so there are advanced trainings for master gardeners periodically that are offered. I try to let y'all know when they're available, where you can learn about how to report invasive species. So if you come across something while you're out doing whatever you can. And that's how it makes it onto these distribution maps, when people recognize what it is, and then they send in a report with pictures and it's verified, and then it makes it onto the map.
Thank you. And then a good question from Lizzie Perez is, how do we get rid of this bamboo? Specifically, probably the golden bamboo you were showing, but possibly talking about all of it.
Yeah, that one's tough. So I know one person who successfully eradicated a stand of golden bamboo, and it involved a backhoe and sifting of all of the soil. And even then, there were still some of the rootlets that were left, and he had to spray for about 1.5 years afterwards. It was an older home that was built in the 50s, and the stand was there for about that time, but it had taken about an acre's worth of land along the Chattahoochee. So it cost him about $3,500 to get it all cleared out. And then he had to continue to walk the property. And every time he would see some coming up, if he couldn't pull it up, then he would spray it. But that took a lot of work and money to get rid of it.
I believe it. Tim Ledford's got more of an observation, but I'll read it real quick because there are a couple of questions to take away from it. But he's talking about there used to be large thickets growing in undeveloped areas, referencing bamboo, wherever there was a stream. 3 or 4 of us would go into the woods every winter, cut hundreds and drag them out to stick pole beans. They were considered very desirable. Everyone says how easy they are to grow. This was very long ago. And then he talks about his dad planting them along a septic tank drain field and how it didn't grow so well. And so one of the questions that could be taken away here would be, what's the difference between bamboo and river cane? Because river cane looks similar, and I believe is a native to the Southeast United States, and it grows by water. That'd be one question, is what's the difference? And then another question could be, is sewage a secret weapon against bamboo, maybe?
I don't think so. Well, I mean, these are all different species. So some do better, and that's the key, is way back when they brought these plants over here, they brought them over because they had some type of desirable characteristic that they really wanted. And bamboo was great at screening. I mean, it was a fast grower. It grew upright. It was attractive. If you lived in town and you had neighbors nearby, it would screen them out so you didn't see them. And that's why it was planted. But, at the time, no one really thought, oh, well, it grew fast, so that's great. It'll grow up, except it also grows out, and it can take over an area really quickly. So, yes, there's river cane, and there's native types of bamboo that are perfectly acceptable to have, and there are a lot of other types that are not, and somehow still have made it into our gardens and are still here, and they're established to the point where now it's almost impossible to root them out unless you're willing to drop a lot of money or a lot of backbreaking labor to get them out.
Well, Judy seems to have an air potato vine in her yard, which she's been pulling out, and used picture this to ID the plants. So we seem to have an identified. So I guess, what would your comment on that be? Go ahead and report it.
Yeah, I gave you the website, click on that and go ahead and report it. Like I mentioned, there was somebody that I talked to last year that had an air potato vine, and I gave him the information to enter it. But that's how invasives work, folks, is you don't think they're there, and then all of a sudden you're aware because you watch something like this and you're like, oh, wait a second, I have that in my backyard. And you didn't ever think about it or what it was, and now you know. And that's how invasives work. They come here, they fly under the radar for a long time, and then all of a sudden you're aware and they're everywhere. And so even though it shows up in a handful of counties in the area, it's probably in all of them.
All right, thank you. And then a good question from Joseph is mulch from Tree of Heaven not to be used?
Mulch.
There's a follow-up question also, as far as, are there trees in general that we should be careful about using mulch? that you
I
know of?
wouldn't use it. I mean, that's one of the ones that produces a chemical that can kill stuff. I mean, I guess if you don't want anything to grow there, you can use it. But if you're trying to put it in and around your prized azalea bed, that's probably not a good idea, because you might end up killing out whatever it is that you had there in the bed. Better safe than sorry. And honestly, because it spreads through rhizomes, you don't want to take the chance that you accidentally missed a rootlet or something like that, and then it takes up residence wherever you mulched it up. So
Tim asks, is there another name for Chinaberry?
That's a good question. I've always called it Chinaberry. I mean, a lot of these, as I was kind of going through the list, if I didn't recognize, now I didn't put the scientific names on here. This was somebody else's presentation. I did add the distribution map because I thought that was important to add so people could see if it was truly something that they needed to worry about immediately, or it was something that they just needed to have on their radar. And I didn't put the scientific name, which typically in horticulture, you want to put the scientific name because a plant may have 6 or 7 different common names, depending on what region you're in, or, that kind of thing. So I forgot the rest of the
Question was, is there a name for Chinaberry? And the answer is most likely several. So
yeah, possibly, depending on where you live and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and if you
but I'm not aware of any off the top of my head.
So Tim could look up the botanical name, the Latin name, and go from there and probably find an answer to that question too, if
Yeah.
It's we answered this question from Joseph. All right, and then is it possible to get the PowerPoint emailed? Desiree asks.
We'll post it up on the YouTube channel, Metro Master Gardener, and we encourage you to go over there to watch it.
And then finally, this may be the last one, or possibly not. Joseph asks, are wildflower seeds native?
Depends on what it is. I mean, you have to look at the definition of native versus endemic and all of that. And so there's all sorts of wildflowers out there, some of which are endemic to Georgia and some which become native over time and do well here, but they're not invasive. And, it kind of depends on what it is. You can buy a wildflower seed mix, Southeastern wildflower seed mix, that has historically accurate seeds that would be found throughout the Southeast. But some of those may have originated from other places. I don't know. I mean, it depends on how far you go back and try to figure out when they were originally brought to the area, who discovered them.
So the answer is it depends. And then you posted some links. All right, and then Lori has a picture of a shrub and several on her property that they just purchased. She's used a plant ID app that says it is a thorny olive. She has not noticed any berries on it. Can she send it to us to confirm? That's what Extension is here for. Oh, there it is. She sent it too. There it is. Is this thorny olive?
It's making me download it.
So Lisa may get back to you on this, Lori.
Let me see.
And some of them are quite large, 5 feet tall, Lori says.
It probably is. And I hate it when it makes me want. Did it just open for you, Eric? Did you have to save it?
You're open on my my chat box here, but it's very small.
Actually, you know what? If you've got it open, you can share your screen and pop it up on the screen if you want to do that.
It's a bit small. Well, I'm pulling it up. All right, so I'm gonna share screen. Give me a second to figure out. Tell me if you can see this. Can everyone see what I'm trying to share here?
Yes. Yeah. So it's definitely one of the olives. I don't know if it's a thorny olive though. It's an Elaeagnus species. Either both of them, I mean, both of them are, they're almost as bad as privet along edges, edge rows, or usually you'll find them, a lot of times you'll find them along a fence row or on the edge of the woods. And it always starts out with one almost singular branch that kind of reaches out, and then all of a sudden within a year or two it proliferates into this big mound that kind of takes over. And the older branches you'll notice you'll start to get more of the thorns on them, on the thorny olive. The autumn olive not as much, but the characteristic is when you flip over the leaves, it's got a really silvery underbelly to it. And it's kind of very thick and waxy. But sometimes you'll get that mottled leaf appearance like you kind of see here on this one. But you can cut them out pretty easily and then use a non-selective herbicide on them. And that should kill out most of it. It may come back or try to come back from the root system, depending on how old the stand is, but you can treat it again to kill it out.
All right. I'm going to stop share. We're going to get through a few more questions. This next question is a really good one. Where can I view the composting talk from March 21st? And I can answer this one because I was just talking to Lisa about this before we started. I looked her in the eyes and said, I will upload it. And then through a series of unfortunate events, I never uploaded it. So I will upload. It was my responsibility. I blew it. I will upload the composting talk from March 21st, like I originally promised I would do. That's on me. And then Joseph asks, the seed we hand out for free. I think it's a question.
Probably wanting it, where can we get it or source it? Is that what the question is? So most of that seed we give out at events. A wildflower seed? Like we did that at the home show. And that was what we'll do is, or what I do is I'll buy in bulk about a pound of Southeastern mixed wildflower seed. It's about $50, give or take. There are websites you can buy it in bulk. And then we put it in little envelopes that we gave away for the trivia wheel, garden trivia. So, I mean, you can, if you really want to buy a bag of that stuff, send me an email and I'll give you the link to the website where you can get it. Air potatoes. I just saw that one pop up. Yes, you can eat air potatoes. Yeah, they were originally brought here for food. They're very starchy.
Okay.
Boil them, like really, really boil them. Actually, they're recipes, which just baffles my mind because it's like it's an invasive plant and you can find recipes and there are websites that say you should grow the air potato. And I'm like, no, you should not grow the air potato. But if you're curious, you can eat the air potato.
Okay. Okay, any other questions before we let everyone get back to their evenings? Thank you, everybody, for sitting in.
And thank you, thanks for coming. I appreciate that. Thank you. And thank you, Eric.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, bye.
Sorry about the slow start when we first got going.
It's okay. Bye.